Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new program from the ARC's Emergency Subcommittee, Planning for the Unexpected. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I'm going to be the technical person on the call today. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat box and I'll try to walk you through it. A couple quick technical notes. There is a delay between when we're actually doing this call and presentation and panel before it gets pushed out to YouTube. So there might be a slight delay from when we actually are able to answer questions if you have them for our speakers. Another quick note too is that we are still looking for people to join the ARC's IDEA Task Force, which is our group that's going to be helping us with diversity and all these great topics that have been coming up recently. So if you have anyone that you want to nominate for this committee, they can be an ARC's member or a non-member, doesn't matter. Please send emails to vicepresident@arcsinfo.org. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to the ARC's Vice President, Samantha Forsco.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the ARC's Emergency Subcommittee program, Planning for the Unexpected, which I know I am probably preaching to the choir out there. We're all having a lot of unexpected things come up. So we wanted to take the time today to talk about how we can kind of plan for things when things we never thought were a possibility, like a global pandemic happening, and how we can maybe use some of the things we've already done in the past to kind of, so we're not starting from scratch, so that we actually have something to go off of. I am moderating the session today, and I'm joined by three wonderful speakers who you see on your screen. We have Irene Karsten, who is the Senior Preventative Conservation Advisor at the Canadian Conservation Institute. She wants to wave, you can see her. Next, we have Shakira Santiago Garcia, who is the Museum Registrar at the University of Puerto Rico. And we also have Tracy Bryan, who is the Director of Facilities at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Thank you all for joining us. I am, as Robin mentioned, Samantha Forsco, the Vice President of ARCS, but I'm also the Board Liaison to the Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee. So I'm very thrilled to be joining you all here today. I will be kind of checking out your questions in the chat. As Robin mentioned, there is a kind of delay on that, but I will be keeping my eyes on it as we go through this. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker, Irene, who's going to show us some slides, and then we will take a quick pause for questions. Irene.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to share with you the approach that we use at the Canadian Conservation Institute to support emergency preparedness response planning at heritage institutions across Canada. And it's an approach that from the outset was intended to be an efficient way to prepare for all kinds of emergencies. Next slide. Including the unexpected. We face the challenge of planning for way too many hazards. We'd like to be ready to deal with each one perfectly, to not feel stupid in the face of the unexpected. CCI's approach to emergency response planning assumes that this isn't possible, and that trying could use up a lot of time without creating a useful plan. So instead, we provide a clear, simple structure for the planning process that includes, next slide, 4 steps to readiness. Know response objectives, build a response team, develop response strategies, and provide resources. Next slide. As well as 10 emergency response objectives that can help with any emergency, even the totally unexpected, even if you don't have a plan. And they include protect people, coordinate the responders, secure the site, limit the damage, save the collection, restore the building, obtain equipment and supplies, inform your publics, plural intended, document the incident, and of course, pay for it all. Next slide, please. We use 3 levels of response strategies: immediate response procedures, all hazards response, and salvage strategies. Next slide. And finally, and perhaps the most important, we want you to have one well-trained team. Next slide. A simple structure doesn't remove the complexity of hazards that an institution may need to deal with. So the question remains, how to plan for all of this and not end up, next slide, drowning in a sea of confusing procedures and way too many pages and documents. Next slide. We manage this in part by integrating a simple risk assessment exercise into the emergency response planning process. Next slide. Next slide, please. The method is derived from the ABC method that we use at CCI for all risk assessment. We use this matrix with two parameters, frequency across the bottom and consequences along the side. Both of the scales are logarithmic, so there is a huge jump in risk magnitude from the bottom left corner, which is almost never trace loss, to the upper right corner, which is loss of almost everything in 1 to 10 years. And the colors and words indicate the risk categories. The goal of this risk assessment exercise is to put hazards in the appropriate box in order to set some priorities for emergency response planning. Next slide. This is done by asking two questions. How often does it occur, and how much value will be lost? The answer to the first question, how often, may be out of your control and is often related to geographical location. The answer to how much loss depends in part on the design of your building and how you care for your collection. Next slide. We provide a worksheet to manage this task. For our Canadian colleagues, we started a resource sheet to accompany it that helps people figure out the answers to two questions for key hazards. It may seem like a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be done in one sitting. We suggest that people start with risks that worry them the most and work from there. This list was compiled from published resources on emergency preparedness, by the way. I didn't make it up. So it's interesting to see what's there as we scroll to the bottom on the next slide. Yeah, it was already on the list. So not so unexpected after all. And for those of you with eagle eyes, you probably noted civil disorder up there too, which has been in the news lately. And we leave room for other hazards as well. I should mention that at CCI, we don't separate emergencies that might be considered business continuity issues from those that threaten to damage collections. Many Canadian heritage institutions, as elsewhere, have few staff or are run by volunteers. We try to keep the process simple for that reason, but it works for big institutions too. Next slide, please. To get back to the exercise, the point is to place these hazards to the best of your ability in the right box on the chart. And here you see a fairly realistic set of risks for a Canadian heritage institution. And in this case, you note that the emergencies that cause the biggest loss are also less frequent. And we often see this pattern because if you had to deal with these hazards more frequently, you would probably have done something to reduce their impact. Next slide. We then suggest where to focus your attention on the high to extreme risks in the yellow and orange boxes, except for the almost never box, and the catastrophic or red risk too, but we have yet to see one. It's not that the others won't happen or won't cause loss, but if you prepare for these risks, you will probably find a way to manage with the others just fine. We also really highly recommend that you try to reduce these risks, not just prepare for response when they occur. If you can't reduce the frequency, you can usually limit the consequences by reinforcing your building and or changing how you care for the collection. Next slide, please. Since we're collection people, we don't often pay as much attention to health and safety risks on the list as maybe we should. If we think about pandemic for a moment, they certainly occur in a single place, at least every 100 years, which probably puts it in the second column from the right for frequency. When lives are at stake and museums lose much of their revenue, I would say that the consequences are not small if we think beyond damage to collections. So pandemic is probably a priority risk for many institutions. I have to admit that CCI at present, we haven't yet drafted any suggested emergency plan procedures for pandemic. We've been caught off guard just as much as anybody else, but we're happy to learn from you. Next slide, please. In our approach, the results of the risk assessment are used mostly for the development of two levels of response strategies: immediate response procedures and all hazards procedures. Next slide. Immediate response procedures in particular, since each priority hazard needs at least a few lines in your plan, but you can skip the lower risks. These procedures outline the first steps in response that primarily target 3 of the 10 objectives: protect people, secure the site, and limit damage. They are intended to guide everyone in the institution, including visitors in some cases. Next slide. Now I'm showing you an example here for hurricane and the kind of statements that might go into an immediate response procedure. Hurricane is something that in Canada mostly affects the East Coast and not often as a high to extreme risk, since we don't see major hurricane force winds due to cooler waters off our shores. So we're lucky that way, especially when some of the rest of you are facing hurricanes or tropical storms right now. Next slide, please. Just as important are immediate response procedures that apply to more than one hazard, such as an evacuation procedure, shown here, or shelter in place, or now that we're dealing with COVID-19, next slide, a procedure for indefinite closure. Developing these multi-purpose immediate response procedures is an excellent way to reduce complexity within the emergency plan. Next slide. Which leads us to the second level of response strategies that need to account for priority emergency risks, all hazards response procedures. You only need one set of these for all emergencies, so it needs to cover off a wide range of incidents in terms of severity and scope. Next slide. And what the all hazards procedures do that immediate response procedures don't do entirely is provide direction towards meeting all 10 emergency objectives, but at a high level, not in a manner that's specific to each hazard. Next slide. And I give you an example here of some procedures for the person on the team who's responsible for collection. We suggest grouping the procedures under statements that characterize the scope of an incident. So some incidents impact collections, but not all. It makes the list easier to scan because they can get fairly lengthy. We provide a plan template to heritage institutions that includes a fairly comprehensive list that can be used as a starting point or for comparison. Next slide. Now here's where the risk of pandemic as a priority risk make things interesting, and where thinking about things in advance becomes really useful. In terms of risk to collections, pandemic is not a huge concern as long as disinfection doesn't get out of hand. But how do you respond to, say, a hurricane in the midst of pandemic? All the normal procedures need to account for the need for physical distancing. Proper PPE, which may be in short supply, is even more critical for salvage work than is usually the case. People you usually count on may be ill or afraid to respond or unable to travel. So inserting some all hazards procedures to alert the team to be ready for these constraints is a good idea. Next slide. For example, consider possibilities for secure outdoor salvage in addition to doing it indoors, and also for arranging workstations that are at least 6 feet apart. These ideas may prove useful in non-pandemic contexts, as this picture illustrates. Thinking across multiple hazards can reveal options that might be missed if you plan too narrowly. Next slide. But because all hazards procedures are general, they have to be able to work for all kinds of situations. They need to be interpreted in the context of a particular incident. And to do so reasonably well requires a well-trained incident management team, the final key element. So we encourage the use of scenario exercises to develop the plan, to test the plan, and to increase decision-making capacity all around. Next slide. We share simple scenarios and exercise sheets to help locate the incident in any institution. Next slide. And encourage the use of floor plans to help visualize the effects of an emergency. Next slide. We train heritage professionals to brainstorm necessary response actions. Next slide. That meet all 10 objectives over the duration of the response. We've tried different exercise formats, but this one shown here is simplest and most effective. And we're just working on ways to do this digitally now rather than using Post-its the way we usually do, so it can be done from a distance. A short meeting of no more than 1 hour a few times a year gets you a long way to creating a good plan and preparing your team. And it's kind of fun despite the talk. Next slide. So that's a quick overview of some of the core components to one approach to preparing and updating your plan. The process doesn't have to be complicated, and it doesn't have to produce long, detailed documents that no one reads and that may not actually apply to emergencies, which never seem to unfold the way we expect them to. It does have to account for those hazards most likely to cause great loss, which a simple risk assessment can help identify. 4 steps to be ready for anything, expected or unexpected. Next slide. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Irene. While we have Robin switching out the slides, I wanted to see if there were any questions for Irene. While they're coming in, I actually have a little bit of a question. You mentioned that, you know, this pandemic caught even you all at CCI off guard. So I was just wondering what the future plans are, if you are planning on doing some, you know, pandemic workshops, or what that might look like, if that is the route you're going.
I would say what we're going to do is sort of what I suggested in the talk, which is to look at pandemic, to look at how people responded, and then say where do we add specific procedures for that context. So yes, definitely, probably a section of all hazards response will say, you know, what if there's also a pandemic? Then what do we do? Or yes, an immediate response procedure for pandemic, and absolutely immediate response procedure for indefinite closure, because that's, I think for collections, that's the biggest thing that people have been challenged by, is they're not on site, how they make sure the collections are safe when they're used to dealing with it on site. So definitely adding those parts to our the materials that we provide to people who are preparing a plan, and then throwing in some scenarios so that people will actually think about it as well.
Great, and we just have a follow-up question also in the comments that says, would you recommend institutions develop an all-hazard procedure as well as hazard-specific procedures, or instead of?
Both.
Yes.
Both, yes. So as I mentioned, you need those immediate response procedures. They're specific. So it's like, if it's a flood or if it's a water leak, you want to stop the leak, you want to turn off the water. That's very specific, quick things that can make a big difference. So you want those for all the higher risk emergencies. And then the all hazards is not geared to specific types of emergencies, but to certain contexts. So it could be not necessarily pandemic, but 2 emergencies at the same time. How does that affect things? That kind of thing. So it's very high level. So for high emergencies that rank high, I would say both. Now for those lower emergencies, you may want an immediate response procedure, and that may be all you really need. As if you want within your institution to have certain steps that people follow when, say, you have a ceiling leak, something like that. Or maybe just people deal with it. It's really up to the institution.
Great. Thank you, Irene. We will have more time for questions for all panelists at the end of the short presentations they have prepared. So please feel free to ask more questions that you might have for Irene in the comments. But I am going to pass this over to Shakira now to hear a little bit more about what's going on in Puerto Rico.
Hi, good afternoon all. My name is Shakira Santiago. I'm the Museum Collection Registrar at the Museum History and Temporary Art at the University of Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Well, in the past 7 months as an island, we've been having all these things together. So we are dealing with earthquakes and with COVID-19, we have a drought, and now we are in the active hurricane season. So, and also yesterday we have a blackout. So, as you can see, is a perfect place if all you want to make an internship. We are more welcome to do this in emergencies, but it also oblige yourself to be more organized to what is going to be your priorities as an emergency. Next slide, please. So this is how I think, and also how our museum staff works, because we are always dealing with 2 or more emergency risks. So we have to make what is the priority one. So we have to prioritize the emergencies. So at the beginning, we were dealing with some infrastructure changes and on the museum, and now we have to deal with we are just hours waiting from the tropical storm. So our prioritization will be right now is going to be tropical storm. So that will be the procedure. We are going to do all the challenges and all the checklist. And also, then I always use the Q&A in my mind. What do I need? For example, we have a 167 pages of emergency plan, disaster plan in the museum. That plan contains a lot of things, also procedures and the plan per se, because we are inside the University of Puerto Rico. So the university is our umbrella institution. So we have to also to align our plan to the university plan, and hopefully would be vice versa, but is something is on the works. So they can insert us in their plan as a priority, as they do as chemistry labs or science labs. So our preventive procedures is going to be one of the most important, and I'm very a pain in the museum with preventing procedures at the museum. So what I can do ahead of, because we know every year by this time we're going to have hurricane season. That will make also floods, and that will also make water lakes. So all those go in the front of the emergency plan, and those are the ones we check in that area. So between June and November, that's the first. Right now, we also in earthquake. It's not a season, but it's an earthquake time. It's been active since December 2019. Just today, we already have 2. So also that had to take care of points how to make my collections safe, and also the staff is very important. And then that makes sense to go to the actual capabilities. How many staff do I have for each emergency? That depends on the emergency. What right now was, and also we have to take care of COVID-19. Then what would be my equipment, my supplies? Everything is running low in PPE. Everything's running low, and we are in another situation because we are an island. We depend on distribution and importation of so it's gonna take longer for us to have to buy and to obtain all the materials, for example, the conservation ones. So that also has to be ahead every time we do purchase for this kind of materials. So it's gonna take like 3 or 4 months before the actually season begins. So I always plan ahead and buy in bulk, so the things doesn't expire. So it's going to be helpful to have a nice storage for all of those as well. And the training for all the museum staff, we are very we have a small museum in staff, but not in size and not in collection size. We are 9 museum staff, and depends on the emergency. We have our we don't use the we are trained in COOP. We know the incident commandment, but since we are so small, so little staff, we also have to do 2 or 3 things at the same time. So the big communication, for example, is go to the director of the museum, because she had to communicate to the university. So that's the priority. And then she come that I came to organize what are the tasks ahead to take care of the museum and the collections. So that's in the And the last one, the outside help and what do I need to train the museum staff. We even train our interns and in all kinds of emergency. We are trained in first aid kit, in first aid, and in AD, and fire extinguishers. So all the museum staff and if they want, it's voluntary, it can act and know what to do, depend on the emergency. Next slide, please. So for example, I did this is a new one. We have in June 22nd, this is what I call a new health threat. We have the biggest Sahara dust event in 15 years. So I realized I don't have that in my plan. What that impact to my collection? So I thought that what happened to those outside sculptures, temperature and humidity controls, what would be the change of it? The HVAC systems, the cleaning of the filters is very important because those are our lungs in the museum. I think we have to be very take care and put the HVAC system right in the top of taking care, especially here because we are in an island and our humidity, temperature controls have to be very monitored and every day. And the exhibition hall does because we are tropical, depends on the architecture of the museum, the opening of the doors is very important to take care of how we're going to do to put less of that dust inside the hall, inside the exhibitions. So because I wasn't there in the museum, I haven't checked it yet because we're still closed right now. So that's the procedures I want to do and change when I get back to physically to the museum. So I use my prioritization of the emergency as a sample what I have here what happened with the Saharan dust event. And right now we have another one coming. So hopefully I get all the data from the NOAA atmospheric, so they have a lot of information scientific, and that's very important. You have to also own the information that you are reading and what you're going to help you for creating your plan and the training. So I'm very meteorology and seismic activities, and also now we have to take it our health threats. Next slide. Next slide. So the emergency plan evaluation, of course, then the coronavirus, we start in lockdown on March 17th until May 30th, but we haven't been able to go back to university, but in June 15th, we have to write the protocols to go inside the to the museum again. The thing is, which person wrote the protocol? It was me, because we are a small museum and the director have a very important task, another task to take care of in this situation. So the finances. So I decided to take care of that because I know the staff, I know the collections. It's a small museum. I know all the protocols for the spaces and the plans from disasters and all of that. So I know what gonna be my weak points and the good points to make this protocol. For the collection impact, I'm looking for the weather changes because right now also we are, as you can see, we have 2 or more emergencies at hand. The housekeeping, very important. The pest monitoring that because we are not there. I don't know what happened. I don't know. I can go and the director and the museum can go at least once every week, but we have to spend a little, very little time because they are ordered, that's from the university protocol, so we can spend a lot of time inside the campus. So what is important for the temperature humidity controls, the workforce, your collection staff is here, it's just me. So in this case, all the museum convert into collection staff when we're going to the everything that is aligned to collections. And very important when you have incoming and outgoing loans, that's very important to put now. And I have one for hurricanes, but now I have to also to do that for pandemic because the in and now the contact, the crates, the cleaning, the isolations, it takes time, it takes space, and now we have to create because this is gonna be in a long time and it is gonna be anytime soon. So we have to put it down and put it in practice so everything everybody stay healthy as we are all and still right now. Next slide. So this is the icons we have in our emergency plans. I wasn't the brain who came up with this. We have a nice coworker and Mariela Collazo, she did this. So it's easier for us because we're artists, we're visuals, we're loving it, we're working in museums, so easier to understand. It's in Spanish, of course. The first page, the first 10 is the one we also have. What is our most imminent threats? So will be the floods, fires, now earthquakes, and then gonna be hurricanes and a tropical storm. Then our blackouts, and then our HVAC systems. So that's the most common. So of course, in the first two, the one in the red is our prep tree, always our tree to call our emergencies, how to communicate with each other, and also is how to communicate inside the university. So because I don't haven't put the health threats now in the emergency plan, so I put the environmental threats. So the Sahara those events and the human level threat. So will be the outbreak, epidemics, pandemics, because we are inside of the university. So we have to take care. Very important how we deal with those also because those are in red. We have I can see we have those that's a human level because all the others were natural phenomena, and then when we call to human level we have another procedures, but we already have the vandalism and protest inside our plan because we are inside the university, and also bomb threats and active shooting. So that means, so between all of those, I read it and now I'm going to make a one to contain those two new divisions. Next slide. The second part of the icons is my salvage and recommended procedures for each of the emergencies. So all the museum staff know what to do for water damage, plastic damage, mold, and another emergency, and the disaster kits. So those are for table training and hands-on experience that I wanted to do in February, March, but we are here. But I know they are gonna love it when I'm going to teach them how to do all those things new that I have been learning on my webinars. So that's why I put it in this on the other side under the trainings part, because we are going to take that in action. So that's the other icons to the emergency equipment, emergency services, and our glossary, because we, our collections manager, we talk in a way, maybe not all the staff in the museum understand what you're talking about. So I'm very thorough. And also I use a lot of the glossary terms in Spanish and English. And sometimes, well, most of them I use it in English, so we have understanding when it's richer for them we have a more general meaning. But in Spanish, you can go, depends on your Spanish, how you're going to do the translation. So it's very important for me. Next slide. And that would be my experience right now. Thank God we didn't have a blackout. And thank you, muchas gracias. And please wear your face mask.
Thank you, Shakira. We have all decided in the comments that you need some sort of Registrar of the Year award for dealing with all of these threats at once. Wow. And people in the chat, you don't even know the half of it. Shakira was also dealing with a blackout just this morning before
Yes.
the presentation. So really appreciate you being here, Shakira. We do have a couple of questions for you in the comments here. You mentioned the kind of priority of the emergency coming through earlier. So there's a question of, do you any of the staff have, oh, excuse me, I'm reading the wrong one. I'm sorry. Do you guys usually agree on the emergency that gets the priority, or is there ever kind of a debate about which emergency is the priority?
Well, we usually know that, for example, hurricane season starts in June 1 and between November 30th. So I already have, that's why very important, the prevention procedures. That's one I don't have to be, in the hurry to do that, because I know that's always gonna happen. And since Maria is active, I know it's gonna happen. The flood, for example, one day can rain 8 inches, and one day 2, but I have a breakage from 2 inches of rain. I didn't have anything from the 8. So you have that emergency. You can prioritize when it happens. As Irene was talking, you have to take care of already to train everybody what to do. Okay, now you have to do the buckets. Now that checklist for that event. And so, but usually they trust on me, so say, Shakira, what we do now? I know they are online and they are sending me tests. I love them, but I'm not going to check it. But that's the procedure, because we are very close knit staff. That's very important. We trust each other. We trust everybody in their area, in education, in designing, and the directors. And so we have to have that trust also in what you do for be able to organize and prioritize.
Great. And another question coming through, it sounds like you might actually have this, but do any of your staff have emergency response responsibilities included in their job descriptions? Or is it just assumed?
No, in job description, no. Like the official job description, no. But we all have our little things to do inside the museum when it goes, because I take care of the art storage, because I know how to handle in that. But I maybe have 2 or 3 volunteers and students. Right now, I can count on them because we are in summer and we have to deal with COVID-19. So now I don't have that help from the intern or the students. They are always very helpful and very present if the museum needs some help. But now I have to take longer the planning, because I have to now put in check everything. I don't come with all the people I was counting on. So, but yes, somebody is in check. So all the computers are unplugged from the offices, and somebody has to check all the windows, because we are a tropical island, so we can open some, so to relieve some. And that's a very important of the design right now with the COVID-19. We have that as a positive point, because we can open our offices windows, so we can have a nice flush of air on the offices, so we also it's not going to be so heavy on the mask wearing or of the HVAC air circulation. So that's it's good to have that options. So it's very important also to check that on the designs of the museums.
Great, thank you. I have one more question, and I feel like we might need to get an insurance person on for this one, but I'm going to ask anyway. But how do all of the hazards kind of affect the value of your collections and your insurance? Like, for example, do you all in Puerto Rico have to pay a higher risk premium? Do you know?
Well, that thing is because we are inside the University of Puerto Rico. All the cultural heritage in the museum or the library or any other collections, I have one coverage in insurance. So is the university who take care of that while is in the university or what is in the museum. But when it's on loan, I have to check to the other museum. So they have coverage for that for my artwork. So now I have to be in the same, so I have to be earthquake and flooding and fire and I don't like to know a lot of things during hurricane season, but I can choose everything and start raining here. So that's part of it, but I'm always in check with the insurance office in the university.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shakira. Like I said,
you're welcome.
We have more time for questions at the end, so please keep
okay.
And I'm gonna pass it over to Tracy next.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I realize as I'm looking at this slide, I should have put this towards the center of my presentation. But this just gives you an idea of what our building looks like when I get ready to talk about some of the most recent incidents in and around the city of Richmond and our locality. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so in planning for the unexpected, we sit there and say, but we have a plan. And we do, and I don't know if everybody can still see me. So here's our plan. This is half of what we do for all hazards, which is the notebook there that you see in the slide. But what we determined was something that Irene had mentioned earlier, is that we also needed immediate actions for people. We needed to bring that list of items, those tasks out of our large binder, which we all know no one reads until the day of the emergency. We hope that they do. We have planning teams. We go through all of this. But at the end of the day, when all of the other daily activities are going on, when all of your other job responsibilities are there, and much like Shakira mentioned, this is not listed in anyone's job description. The official job descriptions are what you do Monday through Friday and the weekends, but it typically does not include how do you react to these emergencies. In our all hazard plan, it is mentioned by title who is responsible for what activity. It is not something, again, that's mentioned in your job description, but everybody's responsibilities kind of change during that emergency. But we realized that we needed an immediate reaction for people. So we came up with their emergency plans, which are that flip chart that you see with all the colors there, kind of in the middle of the slide. That was something that people could go to readily and know what types of actions to take. It is interesting that we're talking about a pandemic, because about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to sit in on a desktop presentation or desktop scenario, and we practiced a pandemic emergency. And we all thought, everybody thought they had the answers. Oh, we have X number of security staff. We have X number of people in our maintenance and in facilities and operations. And we have all of these collection interns and volunteers we can use until the pandemic strikes. And then you start going through all of those different scenarios and how your staff will be affected. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on and what we put in place. But again, as Irene mentioned, you don't want to drown in all of the details and all of the procedures and paperwork you want that immediate response. And I think that's one of the best tools that we've been able to put into place is this quick response, this quick immediate response flip chart that we have. We've also taken that recently and broken it down further so that we are talking just evacuations or sheltering in place, because sheltering in place has become so much more important over the last 5 to 7 years as I've been in my job here, that we needed to know where we could go to shelter in place. Most people never want to leave their desks when you're in the middle of a tornado warning. I can just keep working at my desk till it's time to come home. No, we have a shelter in place plan. We all come in and shelter together. So those sorts of things, and being able to train staff on that before you get to that point. And again, having these tools in place has really helped us. We can go to the next slide. Okay, but then nowhere in this all hazard plan did I ever cover what we were going to need for the pandemic. It's great to say, yes, here is our staffing chart. And we went through with our staff and, categorized, tiered the different positions. So we knew what their communication responsibilities were going to be when we did eventually close the museum, and not just to the public, but within a week's time, the majority of staff were teleworking. So we went through, we had to determine who were the key people who need to be in the building. And much like Shakira had mentioned in some of her presentation, you're still managing for pest control. You are still monitoring your HVAC systems during all of this. There is still the safety and security of the collection and the staff that are here. So making sure you have clearly identified when your museum is closed for a few weeks or even for 3 months, who those people are going to be. We also needed to identify for those people who were going to be in place, and each state had their own restrictions as to how many people could gather. We had a priority list of individuals, of staff members who needed to come in. While we could have our collections team working from home, we had a procedure in place. If you need to come in to switch out files, to get more supplies of whatever it is you're working on from home, there was a procedure that we had to have in place that, you make a phone call or you email Tracy and we will set up a time because we had to think about the coming and going in our museum through our employee entrance. There's not 6 feet of social distancing coming through that door. We typically in the past had never made each individual staff member sign in when they came in. Well, now we wanted to know who was in the building because we bring in that contact tracing element to the pandemic, and wanting to know who has been in the building, who may have come in contact with other people while they were here. And the same applied for vendors and contractors that continued to have to do work in the building. Our testing of fire alarms didn't stop during a pandemic. We still had to have that done. Testing and balancing anything that had to do with their mechanical equipment, changing out of the water in some of the systems or the chemicals that have to be applied to all of that still has to continue. So we needed to make sure that we had protocols for those visitors, for those contractors and vendors in place. And as I have the slide here, how much do we need? Trying to plan not only for the staff that was staying in the building and working, but how do we plan for when we reopen? How much is enough? How much is too much? Knowing that when we originally reopened our museum and we closed down the middle of March, staff were given an opportunity to take what they needed home with them. Getting those laptops, technology was a whole nother thing that I won't even go into, because who can be prepared for all of a sudden 50 people working from home when the majority of them have desktop units sitting in their offices. So that was something that we had to scramble a bit for. But when you're sitting there trying to decide all of these supplies that we need to have back in the building, for the staff that remain. And then when we started what I would refer to as a soft reopening, where we started with just the members of our museum coming in for a few days with a restricted time frame on their visits. And that really helped because all of the planning that we had done, it gave us a chance to figure out what was going to work before we were open to the public. But before we leave this slide, just to mention, so all of what you see here, 3 or 4 different types of masks that we have in here, making sure we had disposable ones to provide to visitors who don't bring their own with them or aren't wearing them when they first approach the building. Additional signage. It took us the Purell that goes in the touchless dispensers. We ordered that the 1st of February. We started doubling down on what we already had in the museum. And we received those refills 3 days before we opened to the public. It took us 3.5 months to get those supplies in. So we were, you can see the Germex there. We were buying things from anytime someone went by a store, pick up what you see. Same thing with gloves and, paper towels. We were doing more disinfecting than we had done in the past. Those high touch surfaces, making sure we're able to take care of all of that. Next slide, please. Okay, so signage, a lot of new signage in the building and the procedure for, where do we get that information from? The sign in the middle of the screen is information directly from the CDC about what our guests should be doing, what our staff is going to be doing, in order to make it a safe visit for everyone. This included the signs that you see for the physical distancing on the left and then the one that's on the right. Those are actually vinyls that we started applying to our elevators, on the inside of the elevators, on the elevator doors, exterior signage on doors. We wanted to make sure that this information was upfront and in the public's view before they got to the doors of the museum. But just wanting to have that information, but being able to know that in the future, we've got this, what was their procedure? What was their timeline? Trying to make sure that as we are scrambling, and I think most of us were at some point, scrambling to decide what information are we going to give the public in this signage. What signs are we going to put on the floor? And you see my tennis shoes and our one-way and, safe distance signs there. Making sure that we've written this down this time around so that we do have this tool going forward. Again, all of us were scrambling and putting some of this information together. And part of that was because the state and nation's response to the pandemic was changing week by week and not knowing when we were going to open. One important thing for us was our executive team and our president and CEO specifically was in touch with our community of museums so that when the museums reopened in this area, it was one clear message of what we were expecting of our guests and what we as a museum community were providing for them. While we didn't all open on the same day and to the same group of people, the messaging was clear, pre-registration in the majority of cases before you come in, mask wearing, social distancing, events, special events and so forth are just not happening at this point. We're doing a lot of virtual events and educational programs. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So again, protocols. This was something that we really started working on the moment the museum closed because we needed protocols for the staff that were remaining in the building. And, I'll tell you, honestly, some of those protocols were really on the 8.5 by 11 piece of paper taped to the door when you came in, because this was, again, evolving as we went. Then the work on what are going to be the protocols for our daily visitors who are coming into the museum, setting those expectations when they go online and get those tickets. They know what to expect before they pull up in our parking lot and see all this signage. And the one thing I wanted to cover were our library patrons. We opened the library a couple of days later than the museum itself. And we had protocols for the library patrons, again, making appointments, a time limit on those. But then it gets into the, part of what we're about our collections, and how do we keep the collections secure and disinfected when you have patrons coming in and wanting to see your collections. So the library has been, I won't say rearranged, but where patrons can sit is a little different. There are tables, just like for many of us who go in restaurants and you have the reserve sign, or you say there's no seating at this table. The same type of situation was handled in our library. Our staff, we learned a few things as we went, as far as sometimes signage isn't really enough. You need also those physical barriers because you have returning patrons, you have returning researchers who were just used to doing things in a certain way. So we had to make sure that we had those physical barriers there as well. We provided gloves, which is not something we typically would do before for every patron, but we had gloves there. We, of course, had additional masks in case anybody needed those. Disinfecting wipes for tables after the patrons left. Staff takes care of that. But plenty of hand sanitizer as they're in there. But the other thing we had was a very specific, and we still do, the return table. So we have that set up so that's where their items are returned to after the research is done. Then those items are transferred to what we call a quarantine area in our collection storage. And so they are returned to a quarantine area for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and it rotates through. So we know those items have been left out for an appropriate amount of time before they are actually reshelved into the collections. Loans, I think, Shakira, you mentioned loans, collection loans in what you were talking about. That was something that did impact our staff because, our registrar, our collections manager was someone who was working outside of the building, but we also had a large exhibition that was supposed to come to us from Chicago. It was its last location was in the city of Chicago. That didn't work out so well because the museum that had the exhibition had closed down. It could not go back to its home museum for all of the recreating of what we wanted versus what had been in the exhibition originally. There was no time to do condition reports. None of that was going to happen and get it here in time for what had been our exhibition schedule. So all of that changed as well. Facility rentals, we had to have protocols that covered what we expected of vendors, our clients, and to also tell people what the site responsibilities were for their event. While we have protocols and guidelines in place, they didn't even begin to cover how we were going to manage that during a pandemic and doing social distancing. So those had to tighten up. We still had to make sure that people understood we are categorized as an entertainment venue in the state of Virginia, which means, we are at 50% capacity for any particular event or room. While we may be able to have a larger number of people, we still have to keep to that 50% capacity. And for any museum or venue that hosts weddings, weddings this year, all of that has been a real challenge. And getting, families to understand that what your expectation is not going to be something that we're going to be able to actually follow through with this year in the way that you envisioned it. We've worked with a lot of couples and families to modify what they're going to be doing. But again, we're not doing large events. These are small events that are coming in. Next slide, because I know we're getting short on time. So to expect the unexpected quickly for us this year, pandemic and how that affected everything that we do, our collections, the physical building itself, making sure that our HVAC system was running optimally, that we were able to bring in some fresh air into places that we could, that we were thinking about people on on our staff. You know, we all say we're plenty deep in all of the divisions that we have, or we have enough to do what we need to do. But now you have staff who have children who are learning from home, who cannot really get help from, say, grandparents, in-laws to help with children because of the physical distancing within family structures as well. And whether or not someone has been exposed themselves to somebody else who tested positive through contact tracing, you find these things out. And then how do you manage that? Weather, we had a very wet spring, which brought some problems for us that kind of set the stage as we were moving into a pandemic. And then we've also experienced several protests in the city of Richmond and what that meant for us, and changing our security protocols into additional perimeter checks throughout the day, and on days when we weren't occupying the building, which was also a problem. You know, when we're closed, how do we continue to monitor the perimeter and go from there? So that was an issue for us that we had to overcome. From the first slide that I had, you notice we had all these banners out front. I have to tell you, I was never so glad to have been closed down during the pandemic before protests started, because that meant we had less signage out front. We didn't have trash collecting in a dumpster. All of these things that we really had to put on a checklist, we didn't have to worry as much about because they didn't exist as we were closed to the public. Next slide, which I think is getting close to the end. Okay, so communication, birds on a wire. I can't emphasize how important the communication was for the staff, even though we weren't here. The majority of people weren't here. We still had to maintain that communication. How do you do that for a very diverse staff? Making sure that everybody is able to read their email, that this is, you know, that you're communicating often, that it is concise communication, two-way, encouraging people to tell you about their concerns. You know, we're reopening and there's still a pandemic going on. How do you handle that? How do you lessen those fears that your staff and your visitors have? And the only way to do that is to continue the dialogue in-house and through your emails, even text messaging. We were using quite a bit, and getting that information to your visitors via social media, your websites, so forth. I know we've run out of time, so I'm gonna close with that and go from there.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button very quick. Please, I do have a couple of questions for you here, Tracy, but please let us know if you have any more questions. I know we're right at the end, but I think we have a couple of minutes that we can chat with our panelists here. One question for you, Tracy, is how did you determine the color of the signage to be blue? Was there like an aesthetic?
Yeah. Well, welcome. We are all about branding here at the museum. And so those blues are within our branding colors that we have here. So that's how we went with the blue choice for the signage everywhere. Mm-hmm.
And then another question in the chat is, how did you determine 50% capacity? Is that mandated by your fire capacity code, city or state? How did that come? How did you determine that?
So the 50% capacity was, you know, state mandated that when we reopened museums, you know, had to have 50% capacity, no matter what your ticket sales were and all that. You still had to keep it at 50% capacity. So in looking at our occupancy permit, looking at those life and safety plans, and realizing that in this gallery, we can have this many people, in this gallery, we can have this many, that gave us information so that we could do the math on how many tickets would we actually give out and or sell within a half an hour. And that also came back down when we're doing events. We still do have some groups that want to have small meetings here. And so that is factored into the room size as well. The room may accommodate 40, so at half capacity. But then we have to look at that physical, that social distancing. So that number decreased even more as we went. But it was in looking at our plans and occupancy permits.
Great. I have a question kind of for all of the panelists as well. But maybe particularly for you, Tracy, as you're the director of facilities. I'm thinking about things like protests and, you know, tear gas being used and things like that. I'm wondering if you had any issues with kind of the HVAC system sucking in anything like that, if you made any modifications.
We did make some modifications early on. We actually had the ability to decrease the amount of fresh air intake that we had. And so the good news is when all of this started, when we went from pandemic to protest, we still weren't open yet for our staff. So we were able to cut that fresh air intake and we're recirculating some air, but with a very small number of people in the building. So that certainly helped. There was a facility that is right next door to us that received a lot of damage and had fire damage and water damage. And that was a concern for us is, you know, we want to make sure that we're not bringing anything else in. That was the closest protest that we had to our building, was of course right next door. And that happened very, very early on. We've had marches that have gone by the building, but nothing that's been any closer than that.
Great. Well, I'm monitoring the questions over here and everybody is saying fantastic job. Thank you so much for lending your time and expertise in these areas. I know we're already over time here, so I don't want to take too much time, but a big thank you again to Tracy, Irene, and Shakira for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you all in our next ARCS programming. Keep your eyes peeled for the emergency subcommittee. We've got lots of things planned. And as always, see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
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 Thanks, Shakira.
Bye.